Today, Australia's housing affordability long con. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, the government has released its latest report on housing affordability. And it is precisely as expected, insofar that, in my opinion, it hooks most of the main points, blames the states, and, by the way, also allows superannuation to be used to encourage more people to buy overpriced property. So this whole process has been a sham, as I expected. But I did want to take you through some of the key points contained within it for two reasons. Firstly, to highlight some of the thematics that are coming through and their limitations, but also to set in context a broader discussion that I had last week with Professor Steve Keen relating to housing affordability and the New Nationals, or the TNL's, approach to dealing with the issue. And in fact, as a separate video, I'm going to post Steve's specific answers relating to housing affordability, so you can compare and contrast real policy coming from the TNL and the sham policies, which is part of the long con, coming from the government. Compare and contrast, and then you can make your own decision. Anyway, I'm now going to talk in more detail about the specifics of this report. The report was called The Australian Dream, an inquiry into housing affordability and supply in Australia, and it was run by the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Tax and Revenue. Now, I want to start with just the chair's forward, because there were some quite interesting points made here, and it's worth reiterating them. They started by saying there have been a fair few inquiries into housing over the past 2 decades, yet house prices and house availability are still problems that face everyday Australians. Well, we can tick an agreement on both those points. Absolutely, there have been way too many inquiries. None of them really had much effect, and house prices and housing affordability and availability are a big issue. When this inquiry was announced, there was some concern about rapid escalating prices at record rates, but this concern only grew as the committee began hearing evidence. And once again, I agree, house prices have gone through the roof, and the last year in particularly, as shown by the ABS data, showed price growth of more than 20% in many parts of the country. The chair's forward went on to say, it was discovered that there were 2 tribes in the Australian housing policy arena. The first tribe consists mainly of planners and academics who believe that the problem is the tax system, which has turned housing into a speculative asset, thereby leading to price increases. Furthermore, this tribe believes that home ownership is an overstated social good, and people should instead allocate their financial resources elsewhere and concentrate on secure long-term rentals. Mum and dad investors are the problem. We need more institutional capital from big super, and increasing supply raises prices. Unless the supply is public housing, are these tribes' common epithets. Well, I have to say that caricature really doesn't do great service to the large number of submissions, more than 200 actually, that really raised some very significant points. And the chair's forward went on to say this tribe has largely run Australian housing policy for the past few decades, presiding over the greatest price rises in recorded history. The second tribe, they say, believes that planning, the administration of the planning system and government intervention have materially damaged home ownership in Australia. This group notes that while the rental property markets matter, home ownership has significant positive externalities that provide real social benefits. And they went on to say reconciling those 2 tribes have proven impossible, though in truth it isn't hard to harmonise them. Tribe 1 deals with the short term, the immediate, transient. Tribe 2 deals with the long term, the structural, the enduring. One of them must be dominant. because both cannot be. And they went on to say there are several questions that this contest of views prompts. First is, how do you appropriately measure affordability, and have we been doing this? And secondly, whether Australia should have an affordable housing market, or are there specific features of this continent that simply do not allow it? And finally, is home ownership desirable, or are houses utilitarian products that provide shelter and nothing else? Australia's founders clearly believed that we should be a property-owning democracy. They did not come to this view because they were real estate agents or because property developers sponsored their various meetings. They came to this view because they wanted Australia to be better than the United Kingdom. They wanted a society not divided by class. In short, they wanted equality of opportunity for everyone. And they knew that the line upon which that division was most etched is the ownership of property. Therefore, everyone needed to be given the chance to own the home in which they live. This has lived with Australians to this day, including in such classic cultural icons as The Castle, in which the lead character denounces a large corporation for trying to buy his house by reminding the High Court that a home is not just bricks and mortar, but memories of a life built together and a place in which to imagine your future. Since this great Australian addition to the philosophical canon, other benefits of ownership have been discovered. Widespread ownership reduces wealth inequality, improves mental health and childhood outcomes, reduces extremism, and provides stability for democratic institutions. Access to home ownership is cited as one of the main reasons many are delaying starting a family. Australia's rate of home ownership has been declining since the baby boom generation bought their homes. At the moment, home ownership rates among Australians under the age of 40 are at levels not seen since 1947. And no one believes that when that figure is updated, it will not fall further, perhaps to the lowest level on record. And I'll just pause there because I actually think that's an important point. Home ownership is going in the wrong direction. It's been going in the wrong direction for some long time. But the reasons are, of course, are more to do with debt than anything else, something which this report managed to skirt around quite nicely. But the data is there. Home ownership is lower than it's been for a long time, and the proportion of people who own their property thanks to a mortgage continues to increase. That, of course, also puts more pressure on the rental sector as well. So there is a long-term structural problem in the country. They went on to say, being able to afford a home is becoming harder and harder for young Australians. Most people focus on the price of the house, but this is short-sighted. The largest barrier to entry for young Australians is saving for the deposit. On all the various measures, the time it takes a worker on average wages to save for a deposit has increased from a number that could be measured in months to one that can be measured in a decade. Once this obstacle has been overcome, it then requires a person or family to afford the servicing of the loan. While self-evidently the price of a house has an impact on this measure of affordability, is only half the story. If the price of a house doubles but interest rates halve, the affordability of a home has not changed. That is why calls for the Reserve Bank of Australia to raise interest rates to lower house prices is probably one of the most absurd ideas in Australian public policy. The fact that people making this argument are never called to account for what they are really saying is extraordinary. Their argument is effectively, we cannot be bothered building more housing, so we just should deny other Australians the opportunity to own their own home. Further, so egregious is our laziness that we would prefer the entire economy suffer rather than deal with the underlying issues of the housing market. Well, 2 points there. The first is, sure, there is definitely a discussion that we should be having about affordable housing supply. But it is worth remembering that there are probably close to 2 million empty properties across the country at the moment. That's hardly mentioned in this report, which is a problem. And secondly, of course, if people are getting those larger mortgages because rates are low, they also have to be aware that rates could well go up. And of course, I have recently been highlighting the sensitivity of households to rising interest rates. Now, because of those large mortgages. And just to re-emphasize that point, if you had a 1.99% mortgage last year and the rate went up to 3%, the amount of repayments that you would have to make on a typical mortgage would rise by 15%. And if that same interest rate went to 4%, then the amount that you would have to pay would rise by, in total, 30%, making the repayments very, very difficult. The point I want to make is that the size of the loan matters as well as the interest rate. Now, they went on to throw a rock at New Zealand. This is largely but not entirely the path the New Zealand government has taken. Perhaps Australia is not able to provide affordable housing stock. Are there physical attributes to our natural environment that preclude us from providing working Australians with affordable and accessible housing? Of course, throughout the course of the inquiry, this trope was put to rest again and again. Australia has more usable land than any other continent in the world outside the penguins of the South Pole. We have one of the least densely populated countries in the world, with some of the highest average weekly earnings and the highest minimum wage in the world. Housing should be easily accessible and affordable, yet by some measures, our 5 largest cities are all in the least 25 affordable markets in the world. And I featured this in a show that I did last week as I highlighted the most recent Demographia report. There are clearly other forces in play, they said, that are diminishing the capacity for Australians to purchase a home. The RBA's view that people are paying more because they can is at best curious, but more likely a misreading of the situation. People do not pay more for their food at the supermarket just because they can afford to. No, you pay more when you have to. I agree with that point, by the way. Builders point to the slow and confusing administration of the planning system, which increases the cost of projects and uncertainty. The National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation brought forward some disturbing analysis. It showed that in parts of Australia, builders have no idea how much they're going to pay in levies prior to a project commencing. Further, most of these levies for infrastructure end up going into operational expenditure and do not add to the livability or amenity for those living in the new housing. First Nations groups told us that in the Pilbara, they have run out of land to build on because council and state government charges are so high that they would represent more than people are willing to pay for the land even before you start building. The result is overcrowding and homelessness in a part of the world with more land than flies. And to be clear, there are lots of flies in the Pilbara. The Housing Industry Association of Australia show that state and council charges and levies now make up a large part of the price of a home and land package, an assessment confirmed in the NHFIC's submission. In short, if you wanted to cut the price of new homes in much of Australia, you could do so by simply removing taxes and levies. The Australian government's latest move is only making a bad problem worse. Now, hang on a moment. We're only talking here about new property builds, but what about the price of all the existing property that has been accelerating in recent times? This is a very important black hole in the report. Most people don't buy brand new property. Most people buy second-hand properties, and those prices have gone up. Why have they gone up? Because of the amount of credit that's available and the bank's willingness to support bigger mortgages. They went on to say, while it continues to be contested, there is ever-increasing evidence that the primary driver of home prices is the lack of market response. That is, price increases not leading to an expansion in supply, as often builders are prevented from responding. For those who point to the capital gains tax concessions of 2001 as setting off a wave of investor activity, there is an obvious counterpoint, if true, which appears to be the case. This should have seen an equal wave in new housing. Instead, we had governments like the Carr government claiming that Sydney was full and therefore closed. Housing prices soared. Econometric analysis has shown that in some places in Australia, planning restrictions are responsible for 67% of the cost of housing. Analysis from Finland has shown that increasing housing supply benefits those on low incomes the most. Flexible planning systems like those in Texas are driving economic growth through lower levels of traffic congestion and more efficient allocation of how land is used. This has led to companies such as Tesla, Facebook and Intel leaving California for Texas. Indeed, over the past 2 years, over 1 million people have voted with their feet and moved from highly regulated planning systems in New York and California to less regulated ones in Texas and Florida. The planning reforms in Tokyo saw homelessness reduced by 80% over 10 years, while highly regulated planning systems in San Francisco have seen the emergence of tent cities with people who cannot find homes. Increasing supply is easier to say but appears hard to do, especially for the federal government. The reasons for this are not difficult to fathom. Communities across Australia have had higher densities imposed on them with minimal input or consultation. The cost has been borne by the few and the benefits by centralised state and local governments and their planners. The federal government needs to incentivise states and local governments to empower communities to make their own choices and trade-offs while offering real benefits to those who bear the costs. These benefits should include better transport infrastructure, improved local amenities, and the assurance of protections and preservation as surrounding areas guaranteed in law, not just spoken of to be broken within a few years. Now, just a point here, of course, this is the hospital pass, so it's the federal government blaming the states for everything. Again, this is the continued mantra from the federal government, nothing to do with us. It's a state problem. If the states pulled their weight and did what they should do, then everything would be solved. But again, to remind you, the elephant in the room is debt and the highly leveraged households that are required to borrow huge amounts of money to be able to pay for the property. None of the things that they're talking about here deals with the root cause issue. And by the way, in my modelling, sure, the costs of development are one issue driving property prices higher, but it's by no means the largest and most significant. Those relating to the debt bomb and the debt burden are significantly more influential in terms of driving property prices higher. And by the way, add in a bit of migration and other factors too, and it's like you're looking at the whole housing problem through a prism that diminishes 90% of the issues and spotlights just one, the supply of property, which of course was what this property, which of course was always going to, and this of course was always going to be the result of this inquiry because its terms of reference were absolutely aligned to the question of property supply. And they went on to say there is no one answer to make housing more affordable, and there are many kinds of people in the country with different needs, some of which will never have those needs met by market housing. No need is greater than the other, and all deserve care and attention. However, for too long, the opportunity for your average working Australian to access the Australian dream has been sacrificed to deal with issues deemed to be of higher priority. And Jason Falinski, the chair, concludes the chair's forward by saying the following report highlights some practical ways that a federal government can cut the Gordian knot of oppressive regulation, muddle-headed central planning, officious big state regulation, and the skinning of new home buyers via a myriad of taxes and charges designed to raise funds, not living standards. We sincerely hope, for the sake of all Australians, especially those seeking access to the promise of Australia, that the recommendations contained in this report are taken up by all involved in the political debate. Now, there's a couple of very important points. I absolutely agree with him that first-time buyers are being skinned, but they're being conned partly by the government itself, who've brought forward all sorts of incentive programs to try and pull people into the market, and then by the banking system and the finance system that ask them to borrow more and to be more leveraged into property. Neither of those are actually good policy strategies, and yet they are the result of long-term failure of management in Australia, management by government, management by the regulators, and by the way, management of the Reserve Bank. Now, as I go on, it's worth just looking again at the terms of reference, because they were carefully crafted to avoid a lot of the big issues. The House of Representatives Standing Committee on Tax and Revenue will inquire into and report on the contribution of tax and regulation on housing affordability and supply. That is, examine the impact of current taxes, charges and regulatory settings at a federal, state and local government level on housing supply. Identify and assess the factors that promote or impede responsive housing supply at the federal, state and local government level, and examine the effectiveness of initiatives to improve housing supply in other jurisdictions and their appropriateness to an Australian context. So let's just be clear, this was always set up as an inquiry into housing supply. It's not talking about the financing, it's not talking about the other demand side issues. That is a major failure of this inquiry, as so many previous ones, and it was carefully crafted such that the federal government could say it's a state problem, and if they only did things differently, everything would be great. Once again, this is a major failure in terms of a government report, but we've seen it before, of course, because the terms of reference ultimately shape the outcome. And if the terms of reference are set by those with a particular agenda, guess what? The outcome they get is that particular agenda. Now, I guess I could stop here and simply leave it at that, but I will just go through the main recommendations because I want you to understand just how limited the recommendations are from this report and how ineffective this whole process has actually been. And just before I do that, I will just highlight who the chair was and the deputy chair and who the members were. They all have some accountability. And I should also add, by the way, that there was a dissenting report, particularly from Labor, who made some broader points, but even their report really didn't get to the heart of the debt-related issue, which is at the heart of housing inaffordability in Australia. So what I'm going to do now is just quickly go through the main recommendations. I won't cover all of them in detail, but I will give you the complete set so that you can then make your own decisions about whether you think they have successfully addressed the main issues. The first recommendation is that the state and local government should increase urban density in appropriate locations using an empowered community framework as currently being trialled in Europe. Australia's cities are some of the least dense populated in the world. There are significant benefits of higher density living. Well, if you are in one of those high density areas, and if you look around you and look at the number of developments going on, you know the problem with higher density living. The planning doesn't support the traffic, the amenities are not there, and frankly, the quality of life diminishes. So this is effectively a free pass to reducing the quality of life for Australians. Shame on them. However, the benefits of higher density living are not shared with those bearing the costs. Government planners force density on communities without discussing the benefits of their proposals and how they're going to ameliorate negative outcomes. State and local governments impose a growing list of levies on developers that are ultimately passed on to purchasers. Those levies are increasingly not used to improve local areas, creating communities that feel disempowered. We recommend that state and local governments need to create more density in appropriate locations, specifically those well serviced by underused transport infrastructure. This should be done by allowing local communities to negotiate for higher densities in return for better infrastructure and more convenience, and in such a way that protects and preserves the character of surrounding areas. The objective is to ensure that communities that are open to higher density experience an uplift in value and improved infrastructure. Okay, so on to recommendation 2. The committee recommends that the Australian government should provide incentive payments to state and local governments to encourage the adoption of better planning and property administration policies. There is abundant and growing evidence that growing planning restrictions substantially boost the cost of housing. Land use policy is primarily responsibility of state and local governments. Nevertheless, the Australian government can and should play a useful role in coordinating guidance and improving incentives. Specifically, the Australian government should provide financial assistance to state and local governments to encourage better planning policy and administration of that policy. We should be rewarding better planning policy administration, for example, streamlining of approvals or bringing infrastructure contributions in line with social costs, such as value capture and sharing. A good model is the National Competition Policy that made payments averaging around $600 million a year from 1997-1998 to 2005-06. Okay, so here they're going to bribe the states to effectively implement higher density planning. Great. Recommendation 3. The committee recommends that the Australian government should institute a grant scheme that pays states and localities for delivering more housing supply and affordable housing. The Australian government should reward better outcomes with grants for those states or localities that deliver more affordable housing. Grants could be in the form of cash or infrastructure. They could, for example, be proportional to overall housing completions or proportional to completions in excess of some benchmarks. If the latter, consultation would be needed to determine appropriate benchmarks. If budgetary conditions are tight, these incentive payments could replace existing programs that deliver low value. In particular, the Australian government provides substantial grants to state and local governments on an unconditional basis. The committee recommends that these payments are linked to outcomes that result in better and more available housing that will in turn see an uplift in home ownership. In other words, yet more bribes to the states to follow what the government wants. Now, the next recommendation is that the committee recommends that the Australian government should adopt the recommendations of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs final report inquiry into homelessness. The committee endorses the recommendations of this separate inquiry. Recommendation 5 is that the committee recommends that the Australian government should work with state governments through grants and subsidies to increase the supply of critical housing, such as crisis housing. In addition to the recommendations of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs final report inquiry into homelessness, the committee recommends that the Australian government work alongside the states to prioritise an increase in the supply pipeline through grants and subsidies of critical housing, particularly targeted for single-income families who are fleeing domestic violence situations are needing to secure long-term housing solutions. Yes, I agree with that. We do need more of that. That is absolutely a priority. Interesting that they've called it out, but it's not the major focus of this report, of course. Recommendation 6 is the committee recommends the Australian government should implement schemes to facilitate private sector partnerships to deliver discount to market rent to own affordable housing. And the committee recommends that the Australian government, led by the Department of Treasury, implement schemes to facilitate partnership with the private sector to deliver discount to market rent to own affordable housing. This will diversify the housing market as well as provide affordable housing options for low to medium income owners, people experiencing homelessness, women escaping domestic violence, parents and children. Yeah, but the point is with these schemes, of course, the private sector wins because they make a profit on the deal. This is not necessarily good policy, and so many examples of public-private partnerships have resulted in poor outcomes for the end user, but a lot of profits for those private sector entities. It's a bit like the build-to-rent market, which is starting to boom. This is not necessarily a very good thing, but of course it's in the neoliberal mould, so you would expect it to be here in this report. And of course, recommendation 7 is a doozy. The committee recommends the Australian government allows first home buyers to use their superannuation assets as security for home loans. The committee recommends the Australian government develop and implement policy allowing first home buyers to use their superannuation balance as collateral for a home without using the funds themselves as a deposit, thereby extending the opportunity for home buyers. The implementation of this policy should depend on also implementing policies to increase the supply of housing, such as recommendation 2. Otherwise, an increase in households' ability to borrow would likely increase property prices. This recommendation will therefore remove the largest barrier for home buyers, being the deposit. So they do understand that availability of credit is actually linked to house price growth. The more that people can pay, the more prices will rise. It's just a pity that what they're doing is essentially getting people more exposed to property. Now your superannuation will be exposed to property too. Is that really a very sensible strategy? Because what you're doing is you're putting all of your assets into the same property basket. I think that's a bit risky personally, but No surprise, that was always going to be in this report. Recommendation 8 is that the committee recommends the Australian government does not change its current policy regarding negative gearing. The committee recommends the Australian government maintain current policy with regard to negative gearing. The committee believes the benefits this policy provides in the form of lower rents, higher housing supply, diversity of ownership and the efficiency of the tax system outweigh the nominal impact it has on house prices. Well, there you go. What a surprise on that one. Of course, negative gearing costs the taxpayer an awful lot each year, and the benefits are somewhat clouded, especially, of course, those that have multiple investment properties and are geared to the gills. But again, no surprise, this is precisely what I expected from this government. Recommendation 9 is the committee recommends that state and territory governments replace stamp duty with land tax. The committee recommends state and territories replace stamp duty with land tax. This should be implemented over time, avoiding those who have already or recently paid stamp duty facing double taxation through the replacement land tax. This change would increase housing turnover, remove an unnecessary obstacle to home ownership, and stabilise government revenues. Yeah, except of course that with stamp duty you pay it at the point of transaction and it's locked away, whereas of course land tax means you get charged every year, and there's always plenty of upside there if people decide to lift the land tax rate. You've got nowhere to run. So it is effectively providing another form of revenue stream. And just to remind you, of course, that the Harbour Bridge toll in Sydney, when it was first brought in, was temporary. Well, it's not temporary, of course, it's still there, because they continue to charge more and more. They always do that. That's what governments do. Recommendation 10 is the committee recommends that the Australian government conduct a review into how transitional costs regarding recommendation 9 might be smoothed, and the committee recommends the Australian government, led by the Department of the Treasury, conduct a review how the traditional costs for recommendation 9 might be smoothed and how adverse effects on fiscal equalisation might be avoided. As the states and territories would be the biggest beneficiaries of this transfer, any money provided by the Australian government should be repaid by the states and territories. And in the interim, the committee recommends that states and territories that adjust stamp duty brackets to readdress decades of stamp duty bracket creep will not be penalised by the Commonwealth Grants Commission in Goods and Services Distribution. And furthermore, the committee recommends that states and territories should adjust stamp duty brackets to readjust decades of stamp duty bracket creep, and they should be indexed in line with inflation in the housing market. So they're actually suggesting you should be paying more stamp duty in the interim. Well, that's great, isn't it? Recommendation 11 is the committee recommends the Australian government work with the state and territory governments to reform developer contributions, ensuring that the money is used for funding value-added and demanded infrastructure. The committee recommends that developer contributions are reformed as they've ballooned, adding nearly half of the housing costs that have failed to provide increased infrastructure. There are two ways this could occur, either replacement with a value capture model or ensuring that developer contributions can only be expended on their intended purposes, development, infrastructure and services. This should form part of the incentive payment recommended in Recommendation 2. The committee recommends the Australian government work with the state and territories to increase the consistency and transparency of developer contributions across the nation and to ensure that such contributions are only used to fund useful, value-adding infrastructure that is genuinely essential for the development on which they are levied. Recommendation 12 is that the committee recommends the Australian government conduct a review into the build-to-rent housing market and how it's affected by current regulations and tax policies. The evidence the committee heard suggests that building-to-rent housing would provide consumers more choice and has the potential to increase security of tenure. As a result, the committee recommends that the Australian government, led by the Department of Treasury, conduct a review into the build-to-rent housing market and how it is affected by progressive land tax and other tax and regulatory settings. Well, no surprise there on that one. Regulation 13, the committee recommends the Australian government continues to support the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority's Prudential Standard, APS 220, to manage authorised deposit-taking institutions lending on housing loans. The committee supports APRA's Prudential Lending Standard to manage ADI lending on housing loans. This support transpires to the powers introduced in 2018 to allow APRA to make rules relating to lending activities of non-ADI lenders if APRA considers that lending by non-ADI lenders is materially contributing to financial system stability risk. Okay, so APRA is only concerned about financial stability risk, nothing else. And of course, APRA says they have nothing to do with house prices. So it's status quo. Recommendation 14 is the committee recommends no change to be made to the Reserve Bank of Australia's current charter, a monetary mandate ensuring that house prices are not a specific objective of monetary policy. The committee reckons that internationally policymakers have been considering whether house prices should be taken into account in addition to inflation and the unemployment rate when setting monetary policy. The committee rejects the recent changes to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's mandate by the New Zealand Labor government to consider house price stability when setting interest rates. No, well, of course, you don't want a central bank taking any accountability for house prices, despite the fact they have the main levers. Monetary policy. What were you to expect? The committee reaffirms that housing prices should not be an objective of monetary policy. The committee considers these changes to be retrograde to the economy with questionable benefits to home buyers. Recommendation 15, the committee recommends the Australian government, led by the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, implement mechanisms and work with states and territories to receive their current and up-to-date forecast data on population, housing approval and completions. Recommendation 16, the committee recommends the Australian government continues to support the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation's concessional loans to infrastructure projects and community housing providers that will unlock new housing supply, particularly affordable housing, with a stronger focus on funding being contingent on supply outcomes. So there you have it. You can see there that this is a mega failure. That's the complete set of their recommendations. So myopically focused on supply, shifting all the focus on the states, endorsing neoliberalism through the housing sector and supporting private development and build to rent, and nothing at all on the core critical issue of housing debt, the debt overhang and the ongoing debt bomb. So if you've listened to me talking about this report, do listen then to the next show that I'm going to post, where Steve Keen talks about housing affordability from a strategic level, and I think gets to the heart of the issue. You can compare and contrast and make your own decisions. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.